Hey everyone, my name is Smriti, and today I'll be walking through question number 3 on the week 6 CSM worksheet, which is called iterators. So here we are going to be constructing an iterator class or an int array iterator class, and then also an int list iterator class. So we'll get to practice actually using iterators and learning how they work. So before we jump into the actual question, I do want to kind of go over what an iterator is and how we use them. So an iterator is an object that allows us to traverse a data structure in a linear fashion. So that was a lot of words. Essentially, an iterator allows you to get values from an array or another data structure by using a next and a has next method. And so here we can see an example of an int iterator, which has a Boolean has next method and a next method. Every single iterator will have these two methods, has next and next. And so has next will return whether there actually is another element in your data structure, and next will actually return the value of the next element. And so one thing to know about iterators is that they don't actually modify the contents of your array or whatever data structure you're using. It's essentially just a pointer system that's going to return values, but it won't actually be modifying it. So for instance, let's say I had an array here, 1, 2, 3, 4. An iterator is kind of like a pointer, or I think in 61A, they kind of described it as like a bookmark. And so an iterator will be pointing at the beginning of your array, and it'll allow you to actually look at every single value in your array using the next and the has next methods. And so you'll be able to retrieve the values here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and print them out, but you actually won't be able to modify the values in your array using your iterator. And so here we can look at some code where you have an int array 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in the example, it says if iter has next, print the next value. So in the beginning, you're going to start and print the first value. So your iterator is going to be pointing at your array. And so your next is going to return the first element in your array. And therefore, it's going to print 1. And so now that you've already, let's make this a little clearer. So your pointer has now printed out the next value, which is 1. So your iterator is going to be pointing here. And so if your iterator has a next, again, it's going to check, is there another element in my array? And there is another element in your array right here. Oh, that was array, sorry. Then you're going to print out next plus 3. So next is going to move your pointer here. And so you're going to print out 2 plus 3, which ends up being 5, as we can see. So this should be 5, and that's correct. And then in our last thing, we use a while loop. And so while your iter, which is basically the iterator over your array R, while it has a next, you're going to keep printing out the next. And so here, you're going to essentially keep traversing the array. So in this instance, you have 3, 4. Let me add to this. So there's also a 5 and a 6. So you're pointing here. First, you're going to move here, and it's going to print out 3. And then it's going to check whether it has a next, which it does. So you're going to move here. It's going to print out 4. And then you're going to move here. And then because it does have a next, which is 5, so you're going to print out 5. 5 does have a next, so you're going to move your next pointer here. And it's going to print out 6. And now you're at the end of the array. And so when the has next over here will actually return false. So this will be false. And so you'll exit your while loop and you'll be done. So you would have printed out the rest of your array. Awesome. So now that we've kind of gone over an example of how to use an iterator, one thing to note is this is how you should be instantiating your iterators. You have to pass in the data structure or the object that you're going to traverse and then declare it as like a new int iterator. We're actually going to be building our int array iterator class that works exactly as how we described above. So given an array, you should be able to traverse it and return every single element. So there's a lot of code that goes into this. We're just going to walk through it line by line and kind of see how each aspect of this iterator functions. So first, we have a blank right here, right? So what goes there? One thing to note is that you want to implement the int iterator interface when you're doing this. So that's why you want to use your implements here, because you're given an int iterator interface up here. Let's highlight it, right? And so you want your iterator to follow like the same blueprint. So you want your iterator to have a has next and a next method. And so that's why we're going to implement that interface. Oh, it should be implements. Cool. And so now when we want to think about what we need for an iterator, you first need kind of like where you are in an array. So you need to keep track of the index that you're at within your array to make sure that you're not kind of like exceeding the bounds of your array, right? Because that's going to return an error. And then you also want to be given an array as well. So we can actually create private variables for both of these things and kind of instantiate them in our constructor. And so here we are going to have let's write this in red so it's a little more clear that it's the solution. So we're going to have our private int index, and then we're also going to have an int array. Awesome. So now we have our index in our array, so we will know exactly where we are in our array. And so in our constructor, what we're going to do is say array, which is the variable we made up here. We're going to initialize that as the array that's passed into the iterator. So it's R. And then our index, we always want to start, let's say we have an array, we always want to start at our 0th index, right? You want to start here when you call .next for the first time. And so you're going to start your index at 0. Cool. So now let's move on to our hasNext method. In our hasNext method, we essentially want to check whether there is another element in our array. And so how do we do this? So for instance, given an array which has 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the only time when hasNext will return false is when you're actually pointing at this last element. And so there's nothing else in the array here. And so it's going to return false, right? So this is where we can kind of utilize our index that we're currently at. So index is going to keep track of where your actual pointer is at in the array. And we can also use the array length. So our hasNext will just return whether index is less than array.length. So this is like a Boolean statement. So if index is less than array.length, it'll return true. And so if your index is less than the length of the array, that means you actually will have another like element in your array to look at. And if your index is greater than your array length, then this is going to return false. And so that means that there's nothing else for you to traverse and that you're at the end of your array, as we saw here. And so your hasNext method will just return false. And so now we can move on to our next method, which is going to look at, it's going to actually return the value that's next in your iterator. And so here we also want to use our index and our array that we defined above. So for our next, we're going to first initialize a value to be the, so let's first initialize a value. So what do we want to set this value to? Well, we actually want to retrieve the element at the index that we're at in our array, right? So if we have our array above, right, let's erase all this extra stuff we wrote for the previous method. Your index is going to be 0. So you're going to be starting at your 0th index. So, and if you call .next for the first time, you actually want to retrieve this first element. Your iterator should be returning 1. And so that's why we want to look at the array's index element. So index is also the name of the variable in this case. So that's why it sounds a little confusing, but hopefully when I write it out, it becomes more clear. Awesome. And so now once you've retrieved this element, your index, you don't want that to be 0 anymore, because the next time you call .next, you want it to return 2, right? You don't want it to return this first element. You want to move your pointer over in your iterator. And so that's why you want to increment your index to be 1, so that the next time you call .next, you'll be returning the right element. So we do index plus equals 1. And at the very end, you want to return value, because your next method should be returning an integer, as we can see here. And also in your hasNext method should be returning a Boolean, which is why we returned a Boolean value here. So awesome. That is our int array iterator class. Now we can move on to our int list iterator class that adheres to the int iterator interface. So just a clue from this question, we can see that it should be implementing the int iterator interface. So it should be basically creating the same exact methods, hasNext and next. So just before we get started with any other part of the code, we can kind of define this class to be public class int list iterator. And this is going to implement our int iterator interface. So this is exactly like our int array iterator, which we defined up here. We saw that it was implementing the same interface. So kind of running out of space on this line, but that's what it's going to return. Cool. So now we can define a couple variables in here, just like we did last time. So let's kind of look at what we want our int list iterator to do. We want to take basically an int list, like I've drawn out up here, and iterate over it. So we want to be able to move a pointer from this first element, return the value here. Let's say that was 1, 2, and 3. And you want to be able to move your pointer with every call to dot next. So this pointer should move here. And then has next should check whether the linked list is basically whether your pointer is at the end of the linked list. And how do we know that? Well, you know that if your second element or your dot rest value is null, that means there's no more to traverse. And so that should return false for the has next method. So now that we've kind of looked at a small example of what this would do, we can start kind of thinking about what pieces we need to create this class. So the first thing we want to do is create a pointer, right? So we want to have a pointer. So last time we had an index to keep track in our array. In this case, we can't actually just have an index, like an integer index anymore. Since you have an int list, it's a data structure where you need to traverse it using a pointer or a node. So here we can actually create a private int list node. And so this is essentially going to serve as our pointer to the int list. So we're just going to create like a new int list that's basically pointing to this one to identify where we're at. And then the next thing we want to do is create our constructor and initialize this node pointer that we have right here. So let's make our public constructor, public int list iterator. It's going to take in an int list list. So we want to pass in something to our iterator that we actually want to iterate over. So we have this list. And then we're going to initialize the node pointer that we have right here. I drew a lot of arrows to it, to be list. Awesome. So now that we've done this step, we can move on to actually implementing our has next in our next method, because we know that if we implement iterator, we need to have both of those methods. So first we can have a Boolean has next method. I think I'm going to run out of space here, so I'll start writing it in the next section. So I think I can fit this method though. And so what do we want to do in our has next? As we discussed above, we want to check whether our pointer is pointing at this last element, right? And so if that pointer is pointing at this null element, that means you don't have anything else left in your linked list. But if you basically are pointing at a value that's not null, then that means that there's a next. And so here we can just return node, which is our pointer, is not equal to null. And that should return the correct Boolean for has next. Awesome. And so the second thing we want to do is create our next method. So sorry, I'm writing it in 3.3, but I'll move this after I finish writing it. So public int next. So first what we want to do, if we look at the structure of how we created our next method here, we have a value, we increment our pointer or our value for our index, and then we also want to return our value. And so we can do the exact same 3 steps here, but we just have to keep in mind that now we're working with a pointer rather than an integer index. So here first we want to say that our int value is equal to node.first, because that's how you retrieve the value in the first value in a linked list, or yeah, the value that you want. So node is our pointer. So for instance, if node is pointing, I have a lot of arrows, let's remove some of them. If node is pointing here, because you already called .next once or 2 times, then our node.first will return the value 2 like we want. So then we want to move our pointer. So our pointer is currently here, right? But the next time you call .next, you actually want it to return 3. So we're going to move this pointer over here. So our node is going to be pointing at 3. So how do we do that? Node is equal to node.rest. That's how we move over a linked list. And then at the very end, we want to return value. Awesome. So that finishes our next method. And I add one more parentheses, I think I'll finish the class. Awesome. So now we have fully created this class for an iterator that iterates over an int list. Cool. So now the last part of this question is define a method printAll that prints every single element in an int iterator. And so one cool thing we can do here is use the int list iterator class that you have just created. It says assume that the iterator is implemented properly, so we don't have to worry about whether our thing actually works, which it actually should work because we did that properly. So let's define this function. So we want to do public. This function can be static because we're not really going to be creating instances of it. Void, because we don't need to return anything. And then printAll is the name of our function. We're going to be passing in an int iterator, which is called iter. Cool. And so now what we want to do is use our hasNext method. So while iter.hasNext, we essentially want to print out the next element. So we're checking to see whether, for instance, we have like a linked list here. So while your iterator basically has next, you're going to just print out the value that you want. So that's what we're doing here. System.out.print ln iter.next. So we see here we're using the hasNext and the next methods that we defined earlier. Awesome. So that is the end of question 3. If you have any questions about anything we went over today, we did do a lot. Definitely reach out to your CSM mentor. But if not, I will see you guys at the next walkthrough.